Tesla may do a 20% discount on China Model 3s is our primary story that we cover today. We also do a look at options on Tesla heading into a very busy period. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time on our channel, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. What we wanted to review today is that there's an interesting phenomenon happening. Well, some housekeeping. Just wanted to thank our Patreon supporters. Also thank our subscribers. If you enjoy our show, please take time to like and subscribe. I also wanted to highlight that after 10 minutes, at about the 12-minute mark, we'll be getting into a fairly heavy discussion of options. So we're not going to try to break any rules or anything in terms of what we say, but we want to encourage those without parental guidance to not view our show after the 10 or 12-minute zone, because it'll get fairly intense, and we do discuss heavily sort of money-making strategies, particularly related to options on Tesla. I also can see whenever any of you say hello, and we'll greet you at the end of the show in deference to those who watch that don't pick up the show as a live feed. And so that should be noted as well. Please also note that we have we wanted to thank those of you who chose to support us as we brought goodies for the workers at our local service facility. They expressed gratitude, and they indicated that it's been a pretty rough week moving a lot of vehicles. And I tried to get some info as to how many vehicles that was, but one could say that they were moving about double the number of cars that they usually move through the facility over the last couple of weeks. And we were actually kind of surprised to see somewhat calm, driven by the fact that the place was picked clean. There was a lot of cars that had been moved out, so there weren't that many vehicles actually on site. So I chose our topic today because something happened last week, which is that there's a story that came out initially from one news organization, but by the time it was picked up by 4 or 5 other organizations, it was hard to tell who the story had actually started with. So the headline was, Tesla may lower price of Model 3 in China by 20%. So I just thought this was a great comment, process, move that was made. As we've been discussing for a long time, Tesla actually has a large, 20% of the shares of Tesla have been shorted. So there's a large number of people who are suffering mightily as the stock price rises. So any small or large news item that comes in that is Tesla negative can cause a number of things to occur. Number one, those that are in the stock will all of a sudden say, oh, wait a second, the stock is going down, we should be concerned. Number two, they can actually say, while the stock is going down, should we get out, and should we run for the hills? So you'll notice that anytime news hits, then it's unexpected. There tends to be, it could be a pop-up if it was good news, but if it's bad news, there's actually a run for the hills and then jump back in if everything's okay phenomenon that might occur. So in this case, it's our opinion that when this news item was introduced, it definitely was not a sort of company-sponsored comment, especially because we're in the quiet period for the stock. And so the fact that we had this news getting out there, it's influencing the stock price of Tesla. It was indicative of the process that large hedge funds can use to have the news shape how stocks they're involved with can move. So in this case, what I wanted to highlight is the fact that if you look at the headline in particular, it didn't say Tesla was going to lower prices by 20%. It said Tesla may lower prices by 20%. And so it's a beautiful way of influencing the stock price, because once the story was introduced, you could say, if this statement was made, Tesla will lower prices by 20%, that's against the law. But if you say it may, that is your general opinion on what might occur, and it's not against the law. So I thought the comment was really beautiful because it allowed whoever presented the story to influence the stock price negatively, but not influence the stock price in a manner so if the SEC came after them later, they could be found out and prosecuted for that. So I have to admit, I think it was a work of art comment that was made, and it's reflective of somebody who's savvy and well-trained on how the system works. So as we've discussed in the past, what tends to happen with Tesla, or any other stock for that matter, is when a piece of news hits, particularly it influences the stock price, it goes through a process. In particular, there are different constituencies, obviously consumers being the smallest percentage, but 60% of the stock is held by large institutions. So when major news hits on a stock, what tends to happen is those institutions will hear the news or read the news. They will then seek guidance from the analysts who specialize in that stock to find out what's going on. And then what you'll notice is a few days after the news has hit, you'll start seeing the stock price move either up or down accordingly. So in this case, the Tesla stock price was rising nicely, and then this news sort of came in to operate somewhat as a damper on the gains in stock price that Tesla was enjoying. So we thought this was really, really interesting to watch because over the next 30 days or so, 30 to 45 days, we expect that Tesla stock price, in theory, could move up anywhere from 20 to 30%. And if in fact that occurs, there's a high likelihood that there are a large number of people who are short the stock who are going to be hurt mightily in the process. So the question mark is, how would they deal with that? Well, one way is to clearly close out their positions and leave, and that's part of the gain in stock price we've seen recently. Another route to deal with it is start introducing stories like these, and the goal then being to completely find a way to lower the stock price with it creating an opening for them to get out. So going back to our earlier process about how things work relative to large institutions, once the analysts write their report, those institutions, it takes 2 or 3 days. The institutions will review in a committee setting what they're going to do with the stock in light of the new news. They then will either buy or sell or stay still accordingly. But it is possible for news to trigger this review process. And so it's fascinating to watch because it's a tried and true method. There is a process. There's a method to the madness. And kind of understanding this can influence your overall process for how you might choose to trade the stock. So I also wanted to bring up this story because heading into the announcement of the next earnings and then how China is doing and how many vehicles are going to be sold there, we think that there are more stories like this that are going to come out. So the next thing that we wanted to cover in this line of the story is that China is actually a pretty critical piece of the next growth phase for Tesla. And when that item came out, we were fascinated by it because of several reasons. Number one is that there's somewhere between 50 and 100,000 vehicles ordered by Chinese residents. The current factory, I believe the target for year one for Tesla is approximately 200,000, maybe 250,000 vehicles in production. So one of the issues that popped up is, why would Tesla want to lower the price by 20% when they've got a line of 100,000 people wanting to buy the vehicle at its current price point? And this is why the skepticism popped up relative to who did the story and why, etc. The second thing that's going on is that we're carefully, this morning we just had a hello from one of our friends from Australia, but there's certain countries like Australia where Tesla has an excellent brand reputation, especially given the amount of success that they've had installing large batteries to help the grid there. So with all these positives in a place like Australia, Australia is one of the places where the penetration of the Model 3 is actually very light. And there are a lot of people have been waiting in line for 3.5 years to get their car and are still waiting. And there are people that weren't in line that would love to have one as well. So one of the outs that we see for Tesla is, instead of having to lower prices by 20% to sell Chinese-made vehicles, they could simply put production on a boat and ship it to Australia and keep prices the same. So it's, in essence, a win-win for Tesla. They sell more cars, they don't have to discount any prices, and they just reduce the count of vehicles coming out of the US and ship them elsewhere. So we were kind of fascinated by sort of this interesting news introduction. So the other issue is that as we see production rising in China, bottom line is that there's a lot of destinations that one could ship the vehicle to that eliminates the need for this 20% price cut that was discussed. And so hence, we think it's pretty clear sort of how and why sort of the hedge fund process is working here. So in general, we think that at least once a week, every week for the next 5 weeks, there'll be a new story that shows up like this, and it mandates a review by us as a press and probably you as an investor in Tesla, et cetera. But you really want to take the time to sort of walk through personal discussion for kind of what's going on in that process. So the next thing that we wanted to look at, and by the way, yes, the Model 3 is in order heavily. There's also the Model Y coming in, and the plant in China is actually set up to deliver both Model Y and Model 3s. And Elon has actually discussed the fact that they're going to introduce the Model Y late spring of 2020 is what's been discussed. It's possible it'll happen in Fremont first, but the way China is set up, we think that that vehicle may start showing up in China first, simply because they're already set up for it and they don't have to change out lines, et cetera, in order to get that vehicle moving. So we wanted to sort of gravitate to another area, which is one of the things that's going on right now, sort of beneath the radar, is ungodly amounts of money being made and lost on the options side of the discussion of Tesla. So we actually had one of our viewers ask, if I would discuss some option strategies that one might employ over the next couple of months to just generally think about. I'm not saying go do this, but the money is pretty amazing. So let me give you a what-if scenario of why it's worth your time to think this through. So when Jim Cramer capitulated 2 weeks ago, we discussed this, Tesla stock price was about $350 a share. So what we explained about Jim is he's what's called a value investor. He's really focused on fundamentals of the company and why it'll do short, and long term. And there are a lot of investors that love or hate him, depending on how much money they've made with him over the time, but he's still, we think, a good quality value investor in terms of the orientation that he uses. So what happened is that, just for giggles, if you take a look at it, when Tesla stock price was at $350, there's something, let's say, that it's called a January 400 call. So when the stock price was at $350, because there are three components of pricing an option. There's delta, which means how much the stock is moving around. There's time value, how much time there is before that option expires. And then there's proximity to price. So basically, we're choosing, because it's a round number, to target the 400 calls. So conservatively, I didn't even look at the chart because you can sort of infer what the number is. Tesla stock price at about 430 right now, which is 30 points above 400. So if you had done a January call at 400 and you did so when the stock was at 350, in theory, those things were approximately $500 a piece. We'll confirm those numbers and list them as you guys ask questions, either in the show or afterwards. And so basically, those things were about $500 a piece. Right now, those things are selling for $3,000 a piece. So this is why it's worth the time to sort of read about and understand what's going on in this space, because the returns one can gain slash the losses that can be incurred on the other side are pretty severe. Now, sane people don't do this regularly because it is definitely risky. However, if you're willing to put in the time and the work to understand trading strategies and how to trade rather than invest, it actually could be very lucrative. And there have been a number of hedge funds that were on the short side of Tesla that switched to the long side, meaning buying calls or buying the stock outright in anticipation of the stock price actually rising. So what we were wanting to get into is the fact that there's actually a book called The Black Swan by Taleb. And in general, what the idea is that in Russia, out of 100,000 white swans, there'll be one black swan. And so there are these hedge funds that actually do a routine that I just described, where they will simply say, hey, this week we're going to take $20, $50, $100,000 and we're going to buy 400 calls on Tesla. And at the end of the week, we may lose $100,000 or we may make $5 or $10 million. It's unknown which of those it's going to be. And they sort of put their money in and they take their chances. So this is an example of how, if you read the Taleb book and you take a look at what's going on with Tesla, it's a very options-rich environment to be in, because not only can you buy call options, you can hedge that by buying calls and puts. So one other strategy I wanted to encourage you to look at the numbers on is another way to trade that option would have been to say, I'd like to purchase, let's say, 10 of the 400 calls on Tesla and 10 of the 350 puts on Tesla at the same time. It's called a straddle. You're buying puts and calls on the same stock. But in this case, it's not exactly at the same price. I mean, another way to even make it easier would be to say, had you purchase 10 calls and 10 puts at the same time on Tesla and then just let it ride, you will have noticed that the puts became fairly worthless and the calls became extremely valuable. And your goal there is to have that number be far higher than what your losses might have been. And so the volatility in Tesla is great enough where there's the potential that you could actually make a great deal of money if you chose to execute that process / strategy. So I think that the next few weeks are going to be wild. The reason is because once it's known exactly how Tesla did this quarter, and then how China is coming in with their numbers, and if Elon gets specific with those numbers, all those models are going to get modified, so we could actually see some very big moves in Tesla's stock price based on this. So we think it's really worth the time to understand, because it could be very, very lucrative to do so. And that's why we wanted to bring that up in our show today and hopefully encourage you and have you make some money in the process of them doing well. I have to say, in the short term, meaning the next 2 or 3 days before it's announced how many vehicles Tesla sold, I think there's a slight pullback risk, because those shorts that have covered and the price was pushed up by them are now in the interesting position where everybody's kind of looking for a pullback as a time to maybe purchase, or a pullback as a time to get out. So I think the current time is a little unfocused unless we get one of the big analysts making a call, either very good or very bad, on Tesla, and we'll find out what that is. The next thing that we wanted to encourage you, obviously you're going to keep your eyes peeled, particularly if you own the stock or own the car, but I think it's definitely worth your time to take to understand what's going on here, because in theory, Tesla's stock price could drop below 300, as some of the analysts are talking about. But on the other hand, it could actually blow right past its current zone and head into the 500s in that period as well, based on having the kind of fundamentals potentially being put under as we enter China. And so the other note we'll make, and we'll be diving more into what our China analysis might be, is just that what we're finding difficult is if you look at there's a car called the E6 that's made by BYD. So if you carefully look at what's going on with that vehicle, it's in essence, if all the specs on it are what you'd see from the Nissan Leaf. It's about 160, 180 miles of range. It actually does have some supercharger capability from what we read, and it has to deal with, as a competitor, the entry of Model 3s that are within the range of what its price is. It's still cheaper, but the Model 3s that it'll compete with are somewhat in that range. And so as this occurs, we're going to find out whether or not, or how it does as a competitor to Tesla. But we think that it's just going to be a bloodbath as Tesla enters relative to current manufacturers, how they're doing, and even how they're doing before Tesla arrived, because there are a lot of people who put their reservations in, they're waiting on their cars to arrive and therefore not buying anything in the interim. And then there's also people going to be trading in a lot of those. Many of the current Model 3s are Prius trade-ins, et cetera. So there's a whole collection of things that are going to be flowing around the introduction of the Chinese-built Model 3 over the next few weeks. And a lot of questions are going to be answered, and those questions being answered are big time going to influence the stock. So we're at the point in the show now where we'd love to have questions that we could field from you if you have any. We actually have a show coming up probably later today, but at the latest by tomorrow, where we're looking at the fact that the Cybertruck is actually going to be at least 1 year late, but possibly 2. And we kind of dive into how and why that's happening, because there are some pretty solid reasons for that. And we particularly want to do that show because there's some people we were listening to who are either waiting for a Model Y or waiting for a Cybertruck. And there's what Elon wants to do, which is the delivery dates he's described, but there's a reality of what he can do based on the resources Tesla has, et cetera. So first item here I wanted to do is say thank you to our friends in New Zealand that said hello. Thanks for doing so. Definitely. Actually, I'm kind of surprised because there's a lot being done by Tesla in Australia in terms of battery packs, but we haven't actually seen greetings from EU, Norway, Holland, Spain, and it's Graham Brown. I've been really surprised to see how much action there's been between Tesla's energy division in Australia, but how little action there's been between New Zealand and Tesla in the same capacity. New Zealand obviously has way more water and wind, I guess, to do turbines in that regard, so it would be limited in need for solar panels and et cetera. 2020, Germany and UK due to bike rule changes. So yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot going on right now in terms of the number of cars needing to be sold by the European manufacturers when it comes to fines that they'll get if they don't in fact put out enough vehicles to cover the number of gas-guzzling SUVs they've been putting out. So yeah, definitely that'll be interesting. There's definitely going to be tax rule changes. I appreciate that. You know, there's also there's this question mark hanging over Europe and even the United States, and that is that, as you all know, at least every other show for the last year, we'd actually dabbled in the fact that it says 0% in UK for 6th of April for EVs. Wow, that's a great deal, Graham. There's a question mark that's been lurking, which is, how do you deal with taxes? So both in the United States, probably the average fuel price right now for regular unleaded is about $3.50. Of that, almost $1 of it, I believe, or at least 50 cents of it, is actually taxes, state, local, and federal. And so those taxes help go towards maintenance of roads, et cetera. And when you go to Europe, they're charging $8 a gallon in essence. And that's broken down between the cost of the gas as well as all those taxes that are collected as well. So all the authorities in Europe are trying to move people towards EVs and eliminating different types of taxes. So it's an interesting circumstance because what happens to the lack of taxes to maintain those roads over time? And I guess we don't have to answer that yet because EVs are only a small or 2 to 5% of vehicles being sold in the United States, Europe, and in China, for example, as the major locations. But the question is, what happens when it becomes 10 or 20%, and you really start seeing the ding in taxes? So I know in California, there's been some discussion of part of your registration might include annual charges of $100, $150 that go with electric vehicles because you're not purchasing the gas to help maintain the roads that you're on. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out across the globe, and especially where you live. We just got a note here from a friend in Norway, and he pointed out it's fun to watch the Tesla story evolve. And Norway has been one of the most amazing sort of consumers of electric vehicles. And a lot of what's done in Norway as norms is being adopted around the world. And so you definitely have the eyes and interest of the world in terms of how things are working there. One of the Norwegian stories that we're looking forward to learning more about is what's happening with the e-tron and now the Porsche as they're sold in that area. Norway is a fairly cold country where once the battery goes below freezing, it has to warm itself up before it can operate normally. So one of the things we've been looking forward to is if we have a 200-mile e-tron and it loses 30 to 50% of its range when it comes to below freezing temperatures, and then perhaps the average temperature in Norway, at least in Fahrenheit, is in that 0 to 5 degree zone in the core of the winter. What happens? What happens deep into the winters when the battery has to push its average temperature above freezing, maybe 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and now you have all of that range that disappears. So it'll be interesting to see how the vehicles respond first, and then how the potential buyers respond to what those customers are experiencing when it comes to those vehicles. So there's some unknowns that are sitting out there, and we look forward to covering that and understanding better. You just posed a question as I was speaking that I did not see, but what I can do is repost it at the bottom of the show at the end, etc. Let's see. Gas tax revenues are going down because of ICE efficiency. EVs are a scapegoat of mostly conservative states that try to block EVs. Comment, not a question, but a very good point. Better fuel economy does reduce taxes because you just buy less fuel. So I'd have to agree with that assessment. At any rate, I wanted to encourage you all to note that we have our Patreon link there. We also have a PayPal link. Could use support to the channel in that fashion. We're really working on upgrading everything we're doing, including mic and camera, and any support provided will go entirely towards that. I wanted to also remind you the S-curve in motion is what was described. Remind you 25 leg lifts per leg as a way to keep the body healthy relative to legs and knees, less chances of operation, etc. Don't forget, no more than once a week for fried foods. Also wanted to encourage you to not go to bed within 2 hours of eating, preferably 4 hours, to let that food digest. And we very much look forward to any and all comments, constructive ones in particular, post-show. I also wanted to remind you that we're starting to post a few of our more popular shows from 1 or 2 years ago, because there are a lot of viewers that have joined us in the last year that have not seen them, but we still think they're relevant, and wanted to precursor you on that as well. Once again, this is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thank you again for those of you who supported us in our goodies for the local service facility efforts. Have a great day. Bye for now. In German, we say tschüss, au revoir. French, lehitrot. Hebrew, choda hafez. Farsi, hejdo. I'm getting a laugh because someone said Dr. Greg, who knew. We also wanted to say ni hao ma in Chinese, which is hello. Zdravstvuyte, Russian, which is also hello. And in Jamaica, we say enough respect, walk good man. Thanks once again for joining us. Look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day, and bye for now.